That's- That would help. Well, thank you for
Right.
Julian. I've got a few questions for you, if that's okay. So the first question is, your game designing started quite early on in your life, even before you had a computer. How did all that come about?
Well, the main influence in my game playing career comes from my father, who was very keen on all kinds of games, including card games such as bridge and backgammon. He played a lot of, and every Christmas he would buy a new board game for us to play. And there were many of these that were very kind of interesting to me, like Escape from Colditz was one that we played, in fact, quite a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and I was inspired from these to try and create my own board games, often using some of the ideas and certainly a lot of the components of these other board games that we were accumulating every year. That was my first inspiration, for sure. The second inspiration was when I was probably about 14 at the school board games club. They had a little library of games. These were much more sophisticated war games, SPI, Avalon Hill style war games, which I was absolutely fascinated by, with very complex rules.
Hmm.
Squad Leader was one that I was particularly fascinated by, and was certainly inspirational and influenced obviously many of my subsequent games. SPI released a game called Sniper again, which was quite inspirational as a sort of squad-based tactical, sort of individual character-based combat, which is something which I obviously specialized a bit in later on. And I guess the third and final influence was really sort of the role-playing boom of the sort of the early 80s. So from about 1980, 81, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with friends on a regular basis. And that was all before, computers came along. So I got my first computer like 1982.
Hmm. So before you had a computer, was it quite difficult to design games that appealed to people? Because I was doing a similar thing when I was quite young. I was getting my brother involved with my games. And I had these rules that were really, really complicated, and he just lost it. There was loads of dice rolls and things you had to do. And I could see him losing interest. But when computers came along, for me, I could see how these could like simplify games immediately. Was it the same for yourself?
Yeah, so obviously I had the idea that some of these complex calculations, which were often simplified in board games to some extent, could be done much more easily and properly, I guess, in a very common on a computer. Probabilistic chances and shot deviations and stuff like that. I mean, so one of my early games, Rebelstar Raiders, I was quite obsessed with getting this shot line of fire system done, which had this like random deviation according to the accuracy of the weapon, and whatever the projectile hit would then potentially damage that piece of terrain or character, whatever it is you hit. So yeah, I was quite interested in sort of implementing some of these war game rules in a kind of more simulation-y kind of way, but obviously very easy for the player to control, as the player doesn't have to calculate anything.
Hmm. When did you get your first computer, and what was it?
So the first computer I got was a X81, which I bought for a princely sum of £25 in 1982 from a friend, and which was amazing. I started to learn basic programming immediately. It had a very serious limitation because it only had 1K of memory. I relatively quickly acquired the 16K RAM pack and proceeded to sort of attach that to the X81 on a big plank of wood to stop the deadly RAM pack wobble, which of course your games to crash. So I learned to program assembly language in that as well. Started exploring that, which obviously served me well when I moved on to the ZX Spectrum, because it's basically the same processor.
Yeah. Hmm. So your first ever computer game that you wrote was it Time Lords?
Yeah, so I designed it, but I didn't program it. So this was based actually on a board game design that I had, a pencil and paper game. and it was a bit fiddly to play because you had to have like a games master, and the games master had to generate the universe based on a set of rules, rolling lots of dice, and then you gather the players and they can play it, and the games master will tell the players what they encounter at a particular planet and a particular time zone. So it's kind of cool, but quite simple. But yes, so that was turned into a computer game for the BBC Model B by a school friend of mine. This was kind of, I think I had my ZX81 at that point, but I hadn't got my ZX Spectrum.
Right.
So, this was the kind of game, you wouldn't be commercially releasing games on the ZX81 at this stage. But we did, that game was published by Redshift as Time Lords. And I did another one with my friend there also called Islandia, which was also on a BBC Model B computer, which I designed in new programs.
Right.
And these were things that I did before I left school.
Right, cool. How did you get in touch with Redshift, or was it the other way around?
Well, I had that's interesting because my mum worked with a colleague who was into war games, miniatures-based war games.
Yeah.
And we sort of moved close to where he was living at some point, and his sons were into games, so we just met. We got together to play games and stuff. And that friend there from this teacher friend of my mum's was one of the people who started Redshift. And the game they started working on was actually a licensed version of one of Games Workshop's first original board games, which is called Apocalypse.
Right.
And they were working on a ZX Spectrum and BBC Model B version of that game. So I sort of joined Redshift to, because I was working at that point on my first ZX Spectrum game, which is called Nebula. So that was the first game. No, actually, I got it wrong because Time Lords was published by Redshift, so I was already in touch with them. But the next, so this all happened very, very quickly. So Time Lords and Islandia were published by Redshift. At the same time, I was working on my first ZX Spectrum game, Nebula, which was also published by Redshift. And in this game, Nebula, I actually programmed that immediately after I left school. So yeah, that was it. So basically, I've known these guys for years, basically, even before they formed Redshift. So as soon as I left school, obviously I wanted to work on games full time with Redshift. So yeah, I did a whole series after that. So I don't know, maybe your next question has got something to do with it,
Well, how did Nebula come to be?
Again, it was influenced on a board game, influenced by a board game called The Sword in the Stars, which is an SPI game, which is like a sort of 4X style multiplayer kind of game of space empires and exploration, which is a very complicated game. So obviously my interpretation was much simpler.
Yeah.
And but broadly speaking, the idea was that you would be a space empire expanding and conquering stars, which have different races and different resource levels. It was fundamentally a multiplayer game, but it did have a sort of AI which you can play against, which worked out reasonably well. And that was it. Again, that one was entirely programmed in BASIC, in fact. But I guess it's probably one of the very, very first sort of computer 4X games, I guess, in terms of it had this, expansion, exploitation, extermination, so on. Didn't have any diplomacy, but you had all the other things, obviously. So it's kind of like a very early 4X game.
Yeah. Right, okay. And Chaos, I mean, that's probably where most people were introduced to your games. How did all that come about? Because that was a brilliant game, like most of your
Chaos.
games.
Yeah, right. So, so I did, I actually did another game for Redshift called Rebelstar Raiders, actually, which was the two-player tactical war game.
Yeah.
So that came before Chaos. Again, mostly programmed in BASIC. So with Chaos, I was much more ambitious. So I was going to write the whole thing in the Z80 assembler. And it was based on a board game that I made a few years earlier while I was still at school. It's sort of like a card-based, wizard-based game, in which the spells that you cast as a wizard come from a deck of cards, and you basically shuffle this and you deal them out to each wizard. Each wizard had certain characteristics. They could have more or less spells, and they had casting chance of modifiers and so on. And to cast a spell, you played the card down and you had to roll to cast it. And if it was a creature, you actually placed the card on a sort of large 11x7 grid, move it around. So that was the original board game, and I was basically doing a fairly faithful implementation of the board game on ZX Spectrum. The map was a little bit larger, had some extra features which I added, which most importantly the illusion mechanic, which is something I couldn't do with the board game, but this idea that you could cast a creature as illusion and it would be 100% casting chance, but it could be disbelieved by another wizard. Which is very cool because it gave the game a little bit of a psychological kind of bluffing thing going on there between the players. So that was something I was working on 1984. I was at university, I think, when I was finishing that off, and that was actually published by Games Workshop because Redshift at that point has ceased to exist, and due to our ongoing relationship with Games Workshop, they published several games of the ex-Redshift people. So Chaos was an original one, but we also did worked on some other board game conversions for Games Workshop, including a version of Talisman, a version of Battle Cars. I think it was just those two. I did a little bit of work on Battle Cars. I did the little car designer bits for Battle Cars. But Chaos was obviously an original game. It was my game, and so.
Was it quite difficult to get the balance right with the spells and the creatures on that?
I have no idea. I can't remember. So I obviously paid some attention to it, but I can't honestly. I also I tested it multiplayer. This is one thing that I was quite keen on doing. But I wouldn't say it had, compared with the amount of testing today's games get, it was very minimal, really, to be honest.
Yeah.
We didn't have a QA department as such. I would test it with, friends and family, and that was it.
Is there anything you had to take out because it just didn't work in Chaos?
Well, there was one thing that I thought I'd taken out, but as it turns out, I hadn't taken it out.
What was that?
Which was the turmoil spell.
Oh yeah.
So I written the code for it, and I thought it was a bit. Again, it didn't appear in the original. I thought it was a bit over the top. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to let players have this one. So you couldn't actually get the turmoil spell as a starting spell. However, you could still get it from the magic tree. So when you cast this magic word, your little wizard can go in the tree, and if you're lucky, that tree would give you an extra spell. Just so happened that it could actually give you this spell called Turmoil. And what this did, it just randomly repositioned everything in the entire arena. Which is kind of fun, but it's a bit random, a bit too random even for me. So I thought this is why I decided to take it out. But as I say, I kind of failed to take it out. So it became a very legendary kind of, almost like Easter egg, even though it was completely unintentional.
I've seen that in the game a few times, yeah.
I think I did take out, I think, one or two other spells, but I honestly can't remember what they were. But it had quite a lot there, actually.
Yeah. Going back to Rebelstar Raiders, you mentioned that it was based on a few board games as well.
Sort of, yeah. I think that one was mostly inspired by the SPI game Sniper, which is this single character level tactical combat one set in World War II. So the original version of Rebelstar Raiders was actually called Combat Commander. I had like 4 scenarios, and they were set in different time periods. There was a medieval one, there was a Second World War one, I can't remember what the others were, but anyway, there were several. But the other guys at Redshift said, well, it's really better to just make this science fiction and just set as a sequence of missions with a bit of a story to it. So
Yeah.
I thought, well, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, let's just make it a sci-fi game. And so that's what it was. It was, science fiction squad tactical game with, I think, 3 or 4 missions. I can't remember. Which you could, but it was interestingly a 2-player only game. There was no AI. You can play versus the computer.
Right.
And surprisingly, yeah, sold quite well considering it had that limitation. Interestingly.
Well, the next stage of that was it was more advanced on every level, really, wasn't it? It was a laser squad.
Yeah.
And you switched to a sort of isometric sort of view, didn't you? There.
Sort of slightly forced perspective view, yes.
Yeah.
It was. It was a much more sophisticated game. I mean, you had kind of line of fire system where the enemies were not visible unless one of your soldiers could see them. You could actually set up and equip your squad with various weapons and armor. Different types of shots, snapshots and aim shots and stuff. Grenades, which you can throw with area effects. Chained explosions with various things, gas canisters and stuff. Environmental destruction, morale systems. It was it was quite a bit more sophisticated than the original Rebelstar Raiders. And of course, it had an AI as well. You could play against the computer. Yeah.
I think one of my.
But actually, before that came Rebelstar, so we actually jumped ahead a little bit there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So Rebelstar was a step up from the original Rebelstar Raiders, and you could play again. The main thing there was that I had to do an AI for it. I tried to get a publisher interested without an AI. I remember going to was it Telecom Soft at the time, and they showed them the game and said it's great, but we need an AI. So I actually literally spent a couple of weeks holed up in my dorm room at university, just figuring out how programming the AI for this game. And it worked, and it was great. So that was cool. But yeah, that was like an intermediate version. And it has something more than the original Rebelstar Raiders, but not as much as Laser Squad. So it didn't have the squad customization at the beginning Laser Squad had. And I missed a few other things, but it was again, you can see this is like an evolution. It's an evolutionary path going on here. So yeah, Laser Squad was obviously the one which I first self-published with my own company with my brother Nick. So we now a publisher actually, which was cool. And then came, we did a sort of an upgrade of Chaos, which was Lords of Chaos, and we made that. So that was quite an ambitious game again. And we were programming it on multiple platforms as well, which was obviously quite hard work. So we were doing Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, Atari ST. The Amiga version was a conversion of the ST version done by another company. So it was, that was pretty big, and we still came back to again like switching between the fantasy and science fiction here. We came back to science fiction again because we started working on Laser Squad 2, which had a proper isometric kind of the big innovation with Laser Squad 2 is that we have essentially a 3-dimensional environment. So we had isometric graphics, but they could be layered to represent multiple floors of a building or or larger environments with proper 3-dimensional trajectories for all of your projectiles and line of sight and stuff. And we had a demo working on that, which we showed to Microprose, obviously. And so there was a guy there called Stephen Hand who was a big fan of the original Laser Squad, and he kind of persuaded Microprose to take this on, but Microprose wanted it to be a much bigger project than just Laser Squad 2, and that's obviously how the first XCOM game came about.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say one of my favorite memories, gaming memories of Laser Squad was looting a body and picking up a grenade that had already been primed. And then looking
Yes. Yeah. It had that kind of little simulation aspect to it. You know, things were left on the floor, grenades are primed, and they would still go off. And you pick them up and you can throw them to another soldier who could catch it theoretically, and so on and so forth. It's kind of but yeah, and you could hide the grenades in plant pots as well. It was it was yeah, it had some little fun little things like that. So it was kind of again, it's probably because of my slightly simulation style approach to making games. I wanted the player to be able to do all these things, even if sometimes they weren't kind of not useful, but still kind of fun, you know. See what I mean?
So XCOM, I can see there's quite a few similarities between the old UFO TV series. Was that?
Yep.
Was that on purpose?
Oh, absolutely, because the Pete Morland, who is essentially the guy responsible for commissioning XCOM, well, him and Stephen Hand, they wanted the theme based on UFOs, and their reference was the original, you know, Jerry Anderson UFO TV series, which I was familiar with, and you know, from that we directly took several things. One, of course, is the concept of a worldwide organization, which has been tasked with the idea of intercepting UFOs, because that's what they do in the original UFO. And the other idea we had was the idea that the interceptions worked at several levels. In the TV show, you had moon-based interceptors, and then air-based interceptors, and then a ground-based interceptor. And in XCOM, we had, well, air-based interceptions. You could also intercept landed UFOs. The idea was that, yes, you try and shoot the UFOs down, or intercept when they landed, and then shot them down. You have to send a team down there to, you know, investigate the crash site. So those aspects were somewhat inspired by the TV show.
Did you have problems getting the balance right with the aliens and their abilities versus the player?
I can't recollect exactly having problems doing that. You know, by the time we got to the later stages of the game, sort of later stages of development, we had a lot of interaction with the QA team at Microprose. There were 4 guys there who were on a project for most of the time, and we had to rely a lot on their feedback on difficulty and balance. And you know, I was continually making adjustments. We did have, though, a kind of auto balancing system in there, not a very strong one, but basically, if the player was doing very well in tactical missions, it would kind of up the difficulty a little bit of subsequent tactical missions. If you weren't doing so well, it would ease off the difficulty, usually by adjusting the number and types of enemies in a tactical mission. So, and the reason I put that in is because I knew that we didn't really have time to thoroughly test the difficulty balancing in the game. So we had this automatic system in. I think it wasn't very strong. You know, there was an effect there, but it wasn't hugely strong. However, it was unfortunately a strong enough factor too. So we had this bug in the game, whereas we had some difficulty levels that you could select as the general game difficulty level, and after you've reloaded a saved game, it would always default back to the basic difficulty level. And unfortunately, the QA team didn't catch it because I'd already implemented properly the auto balancing system. So when I said to them, you know, is this difficulty about right? They always said yes. And we never caught that bug, at least not in the initial launch, only it was fixed later. So, but after the fix, of course, that made the game essentially a lot more difficult on the high difficulty levels, because myself and the QA team had generally not really ever tested it, except on the basic difficulty level. So
Yeah. Was it quite difficult to get the procedural maps working properly?
no, because they're based on a very simple idea. They were little map sections. So we had these pre-designed sections, which were like 10, I think about 10 by 10 tiles, and the map could be up to 50 by 50, which could be up to like 5 by 5 of these map sections. And they were just randomly put together based on some simple rules about what could be placed next to what and what the environment type was and so on. I mean, there were tricky aspects to it. We had to try and, because we had some predefined AI pathing systems in there, and we had to try and connect those, stitch the AI pathing data together after the map was loaded and stuff, and built up. But the underlying principle was quite simple, but it worked well. So.
Was it quite difficult? I keep saying this, sorry. Was it quite difficult? Was it quite difficult to get the AI working properly? Because unlike, let's say, Lasers, which is all based on one level, because it was multi-height buildings and that sort of thing.
Yeah, this was tricky. And obviously, we didn't have very powerful computers. We weren't using an A-star algorithm. We kind of devised our own little path-finding algorithm, which is very, very, very fast, actually. But it wasn't hugely accurate either. And it had several levels to it, like short-range pathfinding, which you could try, which the AI could find a path, say, within 10 tiles of where it was. But we had like long-range pathfinding, which had to be set up manually. So I literally placed in these points in the various maps, which are like the nodes where corridors and doors were and rooms were. And then literally write data which says this one is connected to that node, and then we run a pathfinding algorithm on those nodes for the long-range pathfinding. And so it's quite fiddly. The pathfinding itself was pretty fiddly. The rest of the AI ultimately was still quite simple. We had a little bit of a random factor in there. Usually if the AI was aware there was an enemy around the corner, we were basically doing a little bit of random roll to say, that the alien stays there hidden, or he jumps out and tries to attack you.
Right.
But there was always a chance they would stay there hidden. So there was always a chance there was something potentially around the corner that you hadn't yet spotted. So an alien was just waiting there. Right. But they didn't always do it. So it wasn't always. So the player couldn't necessarily discern a particular pattern of behavior here because it was at least semi-random. There was some factors involved in it. If based on whether the alien thinks it has a good chance of knocking you out or not. If it does, then it'll probably attack. If it doesn't, it's more likely to stay hidden around the corner. But I mean that was cool. So so the AI ultimately works out quite well, even though it wasn't actually that sophisticated.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension in the game, wasn't there?
Yeah.
How did you come up with the alien designs and abilities?
So that was a little bit of a collaboration, really. I had some aliens in mind, which are somewhat derived from UFO folklore, based on a book which I had read by Timothy Good called Alien Liaison. In particular, I was intrigued by the concept of these alien greys, these little characters with the large almond-shaped eyes who had sort of psychic powers, they could paralyze. And this is all described in the book. And so I definitely wanted them in the game. Then one of the artists basically came up with a bunch of ideas, which he drew little sprites for. Because at that time, Stephen Hand in particular at Microprose, he wasn't happy with the ideas I was coming up with because he thought they were too boring. So he said, well, it's fine. So we both, me and him, looked through all the designs of the artists and just picked the ones that we liked the look of, and then I would try and figure out how to make, try to figure what they might do actually in the game itself. And there were some cases where I asked him to change some stuff and maybe make 1 or 2 new ones. So the new ones that we developed after that were the larger Terra-based ones. But we did have the alien greys in there, obviously, so they were there. Anyway, we had like the sector pod, which can infect a host. That was obviously inspired by the Aliens films, that the idea it can infect a host and turn you into a zombie, and then another one, would spurt out of it. Yeah. So yeah, we tried to make sure that they sort of all did sort of different things and had different roles, and had a little bit of progression there, a little bit of hierarchy in their sort of society, I guess. Even though initially they were just what looks like a random collection of different ideas from an artist. So I managed to make sense of it in the end. It was cool. It was good.
So, Terror from the Deep, that was written by a different team, wasn't it?
I didn't really have anything to do with that one. So Microprose wanted to, they sort of wanted to do a sequel, but they wanted it done really quickly in 6 months. And I told them, look, we've taken like 3 years to do the original one. Well, nearly 3 years anyway, 2.5-ish years. We said, well, we can't do anything meaningful in 6 months, and there's only me and Nick. We need to recruit a whole team and all that. Plus, I also wanted to do something a bit different, and so they proposed, well, why don't Microprose do the direct sequel in-house using our engine in 6 months and get it released while we work on the third title in the series. And that's what we agreed to in the end. So they did Terror from the Deep, and we did XCOM Apocalypse. Although, of course, it didn't take them 6 months to do. It took them 12 months to do. And they had a rather large team working on it. I remember going to because we were visiting to discuss Apocalypse stuff, and they had a little release party for XCOM Terror from the Deep, and me and Nick were there for that. And there was 15 people and everything. I thought, wow, this is a massive team. All these people did Terror from the Deep, and because on the original XCOM, apart from me and Nick, there was basically 2 artists. There was 1 artist for the last part of the project, but it's very small scale.
So going on to XCOM Apocalypse. So on that game, you had a real-time option as well, didn't you? Do you think that worked?
Yeah. That's a difficult question. It's like you're trying to say, are you completely nuts or what? I think it worked, and it was difficult to do. I quite liked it, but again, it's not necessarily something I would attempt to do again. So it worked in the sense that it did actually work, but was it really the right way to make such a game? Probably not. But there you go. A lot of people liked it, but it was the game had a lot of problems with usability there, I think. Even though we tried to streamline it with the squad control systems and stuff like that. You try to micromanage your soldiers and squads. You could sort of do it, but actually, it's so fiddly that a lot of time you just didn't really bother with that. You just, for each squad, you just clicked on the destination and they just go away and shoot at will, basically, and that's it. It was interesting, though. It was, So, it worked at a certain level, but not probably as well as I would have liked.
Around about that time, the market was changing, and people were switching to consoles a lot more. Did that change the way you were looking at games and designing games?
Yeah, so by the end of the 90s, we were very keen, because the computer, the PC market was in serious trouble, actually, as a consequence of piracy, very poor quality, buggy releases. You know, it wasn't so easy to get patches for games. And you know, obviously piracy was a big, very, very big factor, of course. So consoles were relatively immune from these problems. So we tried to, you know, we tried to switch to doing consoles probably some too late. Right near the end of Mythos games, we were working on essentially a sort of a remake of the original XCOM, but for PlayStation and PC at the same time. And we thought we'd use some middleware. That didn't work out very well. Ultimately, we had to liquidate the company because our publisher, Virgin Interactive, was sold and also liquidated and stuff. It was so that project was kind of abandoned. But yeah, we were trying to get into consoles at that point, but we never managed to release anything in consoles actually until we did what do we call it? We called it Rebelstar, I think, which was for the GBA, Game Boy Advance.
Oh yeah.
Which we did in when was that release? 2005, I think. Sean, I'm gonna have to go shortly. Is there? I've got about 5 more minutes. We can resume this later if you want, but I don't know.
That's okay.
How much more.
I've just got one last question, if that's okay. So,
all right, okay.
So you seem to always go back to your games and sort of refine them and polish them. So you did Chaos Reborn. That was a brilliant game, a brilliant example of it. Do you think you're just on this mission to just make every single one of your games as perfect as possible?
Well, at this stage, probably not. I'm not sure what I'm trying to do at the moment, but I'm still intrigued by turn-based games. I still think I would like to work on those for sure. I can't really reveal what I'm working on at the moment, though, so there's not much I can say. The answer is not any more.
Right.
But then again, watch this space. You never know.
Perfect. Well, thanks for the interview, Julian. As usual, you're very interesting, and you know, it's been really interesting talking to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You take care, mate. I'll be in touch soon.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.